Welcome to the Neuroperformance Podcast with your host, Andy Murphy. Join us as we delve into the advanced high-performance tactics he uses with his elite clientele across the globe. Let's unlock a whole new world of business potential together.
So everybody, you've had my really interesting intro because today's guest kind of special to me. It's he's become a friend, and I'm really excited to become more of a friend of him. But I want you to welcome Mr. Jim Adduci.
Andy, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you again, albeit on the screen, but I hope to see you again soon in Cayman.
I will be there, and that's the great thing, wasn't it? It's what we in October the 31st today, so we're coming up to it's that Christmas time again, and you're going to be
Yes.
spending more time over there, and that's like a year since I actually saw you. And so how's your year been? How's 2024 treated you, Jim?
It's been very interesting, Andy. As I indicated to you, I retired a couple of years ago, so I have time, sometimes too much time on my hand. I went from working 24/7 to not having to go into the office. I worked when people still went to the office to work. Seems to be no longer the case, but it's been very interesting. I've continued to be active in golf, and I continue to swim as I did in Cayman.
Yes.
My wife and I are traveling quite a bit. We've been in New York a couple of times, and we're planning. We hope to go over to Italy in a month or so, and back to I want to show the hometown where my father was born, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit.
Yeah.
So it's been a good time.
That must have been a radical shift for you, retiring. That must have been because, like you say, for someone of your
Mm.
prestige, and we'll get into all that, and I've explained it in the intro, but you were really a pioneer in this area of law, and you were in patent law, right? You were really the man who was driving this thing, especially in DC and especially in the US. And so what that means is I want to look through your lens. I want to look through your world a little. And take us a lawyer, like people have perceptions of what law is and what law means, but I look at it like you were an entrepreneur. You're an entrepreneur. You're building a business. You're running teams. You're selling. You're negotiating. You're closing contracts. You're seeing the vision. You're going through these highs and lows, these emotional roller coasters, and this dopamine addiction because you have to run at such pace, right? That's what I
Yes.
see. So when you retired, was that a hard decision, first of all?
No, I was at a point where having practiced in private practice for 41 years, I was ready to do other things, and there was a wonderful group of younger attorneys who were ready to take over, and I was happy to do that.
Okay. So did you feel at that point because you had these young attorneys, did you feel like you were mentoring them? Did they become mentors, like mentees of yours?
Oh,
Did-
very much so. Many of the attorneys that we hired came from the International Trade Commission, where I worked originally, and
ICC.
and that was great fun. I mean, just to mentoring these young people um, they most of them already knew the law that we were practicing, but
Sure,
to
sure.
teach them to shoot high and think big, and that was
Interesting.
much of the satisfaction I got out of the practice was working with the people around me at all levels, and and I
I could
still
see
have.
that, Jim. I could see that because that's what I was just saying before we started. One of the things that I loved about you when I first met you is that I could see a wealth of wisdom, a wealth of experience, and you just came over calm, right? And just calm. And
Ah,
calmness calmness doesn't usually come innately for everybody, right? So that is that such a learned skill because you've been through so much, such high pressure circumstances. Did you learn that, or were you always quite calm? And we want to talk about your father because I know that was a big influence on
Yes.
you. But is that was that a learned skill? Were you always like this, or
Uh, that's a good question, Andy. And I think the answer is that I've always been on the calm side.
okay?
I'm not one to reach high emotion on any given subject and just take it as it comes.
That's great. So is that one of the things that you'd look for when you were mentoring these younger lawyers? Could you see who was going to be successful when you
I
first met
think
them?
so. I think so.
Yeah,
I think the record proves me out. There are many
sure.
young people who came to my firm that learned the skills, and many of them, because they were so good, got picked off by much larger firms. You know, I had a boutique firm, and
Sure.
after the statute that I was working with became so important, many of the much larger general firms wanted to jump in the game, and they made every effort to pluck the people from my firm who knew the statute and what they were doing.
How was that a good thing? Were you happy for them in some ways that they were going to these things, or was it a case of you? Was it like a battle with these companies, these firms for
No,
yourself?
no, no, no. No, it was mixed. I mean, I enjoyed having these people
Sure.
uh, working with me, but you know, if I saw an opportunity in another organization, particularly in another part of the country that they wanted to live, I was, you know, I never resisted it. I let them go on.
That's beautiful in so many different ways because it's kind of like you're allowing them, it's kind of like you're letting them fly the nest,
Yes.
right? You know, that's a really powerful thing. Do you think? And we'll get into the. I'm really interested in the ITC. I'm really interested in this law, the 337 litigation, and then in from. But I just want to ask what what do you think drove you to this success? Because was there must have been like this inner fire in you and that vision. So what made you get out of bed each day? What made because once you've made money and you've done quite well, so what there must be so much more.
Well, much of it, Andy, goes back to my father, and he told me
Beautiful.
this when I understood English. He said, "Always be number one," and
Mm,
he lived that rule, and I'll tell you more about him. But
please.
throughout my career, both in school and the other activities that I engaged in, debate was very important to me. The debate clubs that I belonged to, um, but shooting for the top. And you mentioned some other people that worked for me that went to other firms. Uh, Several of them went out to start their own firms, and I was very happy to see that, and
Yeah.
was hoping that what they had learned with me would help them be successful in their own practice.
Of course, of
Um,
course. So you were practicing debating, and we'll get into your dad because this was one of the most fascinating. Because we were sitting there at Christmas time, we were in the Cayman Islands, and I started to pick your brain a little because I found you fascinating straight away. And you we were looking over the beautiful ocean in that in the beautiful where you own an amazing apartment, and you were telling me all about the impact that your father had on you, and maybe good, maybe bad, maybe highs, maybe lows, but he sounded an incredible human.
Yes, he was, Andy, and clearly he was the biggest influence in my life.
Yes, yes,
Uh, a little background that you might find interesting. My
please.
father was born in Italy and came to this country at age 7.
Oh,
And uh, came to a little town called Monroe, Michigan, just south of Detroit, with he and his brother and sister, two brothers and sister, and one was born later. Um, and this was during the Depression years. So they had no money. My grandfather, worked in a stone quarry and later went into the farming business, had a little farm of his own. But my father came here and learned to speak English rather quickly, but strove to shoot for the top of everything he did. He was
Right.
editor of the yearbook. He was a four-letter man in sports. Uh, and then he graduated and he was actually accepted at the University of Michigan, but
Okay.
he had no money, so he couldn't go. So he came home and he said to his mother, Maria, he said, Mom, I'm going to join the army. And he
Wow.
joined the army and he got sent over to a place called Pearl Harbor, Hawaii,
Wow.
1 week before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
For real? I don't remember yet. I don't remember that part of this. 1 week before.
1 week, and
Talk
he
about
uh, he
timing.
was he was wounded slightly, not seriously. His brother, who was there in the Navy, was very badly wounded and spent the rest of his life in the Veterans Hospital. But my dad uh, told his commander, he said, I want to be an officer. And they said, well, you can't be an officer because in those days you had to have a college degree. I
Right.
said, but there's a test you can take. And so my father said, all right. And he studied and he studied. And I think he was number one out of 500. And
Of
he
course
got
he
his
was.
commission as a lieutenant. And he said, I want to fly airplanes. So they said, okay, you can go to flight school. And he went to flight school and he ended up flying B-26 bombers out of England over Europe during the war.
Whoa.
And I'm very proud of this part. He became what is to this day, both in the history of the Army Air Corps and the United States Air Force, the youngest lieutenant colonel in history at age 23.
Wow.
So that's the kind of man he was. He went to the top of everything he did. He was a great leader. He
Sure.
inspired all those around him. Uh,
Wow.
then after the war, he came back to Michigan. He married the most beautiful man and woman in Monroe, my mother, Kathleen,
Really?
and was still in the Air Force at the time. Went over to Tokyo for a couple of years. Came
Okay.
back to Washington, D.C., and became the uh, Air Force liaison to Congress. So he became very active on the Hill and got to know a number of very important congressmen. He retired from the Air Force a few years after that and went on to become the executive vice president of the Electronic Industries Association of America. After that, became the president of the Aerospace Industries Association,
Wow.
and then finally became the president of the Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association of America, with offices both in Washington and in Detroit. So he got to go back to his old state of
Ah,
Michigan, and
okay.
after that retired. Among other things, he wrote his autobiography, which uh,
Told me about this.
yeah, which I
Yes.
had published. It's called The Little Immigrant, and it's a brilliant book. And I will bring you a copy when I see you next.
Thank you, sir.
Uh, so he was my inspiration, and he always
Yeah.
said, always think big and go to the top, go for the top, settle for nothing less. And if I thought if he could do it with what little he started with,
Oh,
the advantages I had that he gave me growing up, I had that same responsibility.
and that's what beautiful. And thank you for that story. That's like you reminded me, like, because I loved it at the time. We were sitting in Christmas, but that's responsibility. That's a key beautiful word that you said there. Responsibility. Is that the thing that drove you? I'm looking for the emotional driver in you, Jim. You know what pulled you each day? And I don't mean push, but pulled you to that vision that you had in your head.
Um, every situation I was confronted with, Andy, I thought this is a challenge.
Okay.
How can I turn that challenge into success? And I was always striving to take the next step.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and there's more to that story, but uh,
That's
that's
for
what
part
drove me.
two, Jim.
I heeded my father's words. He said, "Never
Mm.
settle for anything but being the best at what you do."
And you definitely took that box. You know what I mean? You definitely
Mhm.
took that box. And I suppose that's a nice tie into something that you really, I think it was quite personal for you, which is we go back to 19, you were talking about the number, the 1974 with Geneva and this law and how that really catapulted your career. So tell
Sure.
me more about all of that.
Yes, sure, Andy. Well, as you know, I pardon me.
No, it's okay.
Um, After law school, I got a job working as the legal assistant to a commissioner at the United States International Trade Commission, or they call it
Okay.
the ITC for short. The ITC is an executive agency of the U.S. government responsible for, among other things, administering the trade laws of the United States, like the anti-dumping and countervailing duty law, the safeguard law, and um, just before I joined the commission, the Congress enacted what's called the Trade Act of 1974, and it created a statute called Section 337 of the
Okay.
Trade Act of 1974. And Section 337 provided that the ITC, following an investigation and hearing, uh, uh, was able to decide whether to exclude imported products from coming into the United States, uh,
Okay.
usually based on an unfair act. And in the vast majority of the time, the unfair act was patent infringement. So if a foreign manufacturer was manufacturing a widget in Tokyo and
Okay.
importing to the United States, and if the domestic manufacturer of that product in the United States felt that it was infringing, they could bring a case to the ITC, which would be litigated at the ITC. It was a full administrative procedure hearing process. And if the ITC determined that there was a violation, in fact, that there was patent infringement of that product, then they had the authority through the Customs and Border Patrol uh, agency to exclude those products for the term of the patent. So it was a very powerful, powerful statute. You
Yeah.
could get the same thing in United States District Court, but the beauty of the ITC was it was much, much faster. Whereas the same action would last several years or up to several years in district court, the ITC generally concluded their investigations within 12 months.
Is that
So it
right?
was a very, very fast remedy. And
Yeah.
uh, not many people knew about it when I uh, left the commission, and it was the appeal of that statute and my familiarity with that statute and my belief that other companies, for the reasons I gave you, would find it attractive,
Oh,
would hopefully retain me to bring those kind of cases to the ITC. And that's
gotcha. So you became like a private detective with this stuff. You literally investigated like the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts, and everything of what was happening. And because there must have been so many people trying to like, is it stealing people's ideas? Is it what would you define it as? Because that's a whole industry of people copying and replicating people's
yeah.
intellectual property.
Yes. Well, in some cases, the foreign manufacturers, in some cases, knew that there was a U.S. patent on that product and that they might be infringing it.
Okay.
In other cases, they simply came up with the same idea and the same product uh, that they,
Oh,
in many cases, didn't know had been patented in the United
interesting.
States.
Interesting.
Yes,
Interesting. That makes sense. That makes sense, right? Because it's not everyone's trying to do something shady. It's just that everyone's some people are just creative and found a great product.
correct.
Interesting. There's a big
Yeah.
difference, right? There's a big difference. So did you so what happened after that? Because you that's where you started your career, right? Was and you just
Well,
you
I,
go
I
from
s- started my career at the ITC. I spent
yeah.
2 years there, and being as the lawyer to one of the commissioners there,
Okay.
and I did things lawyers do. I wrote opinions. I did legal memorandum on various subjects. But I also learned the work of the ITC, including Section 337,
Okay, okay,
which was not well known or used at the time. Uh, After 2 years, I was selected. Not sure why, but I was selected to go to Geneva, Switzerland, with the Office of the United States Trade Representative to participate in the Multilateral Trade Negotiations in Geneva. And
mm,
this is through what was then called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. And I was part of the US delegation, and we were involved in negotiating primarily what was called the safeguard negotiation
okay.
uh, in Geneva. And I participated to some extent as a negotiator, also as a note keeper for the guy I was working for. But I
Mhm.
thoroughly enjoyed it, and I loved my time in Geneva. It's just, I don't know if you've been there, but
No, not yet, not yet.
it's a beautiful, beautiful city right on the banks of the Lake Geneva, with France a couple
Wow.
blocks away and Italy a couple blocks away. So it was a wonderful year
Ah,
that I spent there. And then we concluded the negotiation, and it was time to go back home. And I went back to Washington, D.C., which is
okay,
where I was raised. And I had the choice of either going back to the ITC or considering the possibility of joining some much larger firms. And I decided, uh, with very little money in the bank,
sure.
that if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to start my own firm. And I made that decision. And that was
Oh,
probably one of the more difficult decisions I had to make.
right.
And, uh, I had just started having a family at the time, with all the demands that are put on you when you have a small child. But I
Sure.
decided to do it, and
Good.
uh, I associated with a couple of other people, and later with one of the gentlemen that I worked with at the ITC, and started the firm. And I went several months without any business. I was quickly going through what little savings I had,
Sure.
and then suddenly one, two, and then three cases came. Rather small cases, but enough to keep the firm going. And
Beautiful.
we were successful in those cases. And people were beginning to notice this Section 337 statute, which, as I say, allows a US company to exclude products coming into the United States that they're competing with that are
Right.
infringing their patents. Um, Now, we were known, Andy, as being specialists in ITC practice,
Okay.
which means that we handled, I'll tell you which aspects of the case, but
Cool.
we did not generally do the patent part of the case. For that, we would associate with patent firms,
Gotcha.
small and large.
Gotcha.
At the ITC, we would be the lead attorneys in dealing with our offices at the ITC, the general
Okay.
counsel, the investigative attorneys there. Um, One of the elements of the statute is you have to have a domestic industry. You have to prove that that the complainant, the person that brought the case, is actually making products here in the United States. There has to be a domestic industry. It has to be economically significant. And in
Okay.
those days, you had to prove that the imports were injuring, harming the domestic industry
Oh,
in the United States. So part of our job was to prove injury to the domestic industry. We had to prove that it
interesting.
was efficiently run, et cetera, et cetera. And then these cases would go, as in district court, you would go through discovery, you would take depositions, you would exchange documents, et cetera. And then you would take the case before a judge. There were, at the time, still are, 6 administrative law judges at the ITC
Gotcha.
who, so you who hold a hearing, and the hearings were generally about a week to 10 days. You would make your opening statements, and you would call your witnesses. You would put on your witnesses.
Oh,
You would cross-examine the other
wow.
witnesses. I must say, one of my favorite parts of practice was cross-examination. I enjoyed it. I think much of it goes back to my debate days in high school
Yeah, we're gonna
and
get
college.
into this in a minute. I'm fascinated with
Yeah,
that. That's
and
great.
then we would bring this case before the judge. The judge would make what they called an initial determination, which would
Okay.
then go to the full commission, the commissioners. There were 6 commissioners, and they
Sure.
would either accept or reject the recommendation of the administrative law judge. They generally accepted it. Then that decision went to the president, who generally approved it, and then to the customs service of the United States that had
Wow.
responsibility for enforcing the exclusion order at the various ports of entry where these products were coming in from abroad.
Gotcha.
So,
Gotcha. That's a process. So let's go back to you cross-examining, Jim, right? So
mm,
I'm fascinated because I love this, right? Because one of the things, it's persuasion, it's influence, it's sales, it's reading body language, it's being creative, right?
yes.
Are these tactics and strategies that you learned? Are these things that you picked up along the way? Did you teach them to your mentees? I mean, explain
Yes.
more about that.
Well, it began as a young child, and my parents would have parties at their house, and they would
Yeah.
always encourage me to get up and speak. And on any given
Ah,
subject. And so as a 5-year-old, I got up and I made speeches to the crowd. When I was in the Cub Scouts, I had to make speeches to the entire pack of scouts.
sure.
Um, and then, so I enjoyed it, and I felt very comfortable before people arguing and making speeches. In high school, I joined the debate team,
Okay.
and I actually became captain of the debate team
Of
and
course you did.
argued cases both with our school and with other schools in the area. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And the part I enjoyed the most was uh, the ability to cross-examine uh,
Right, right.
your opponents. And so I did that, and then I went on and I also debated in college and uh, for all 4 years, and I
Wow.
traveled around the country debating other schools, and so I thoroughly enjoyed it. And but I must say the most important and exciting part for me was the cross-examination of witnesses,
Yeah.
and that carried on to my career in law.
How funny, how interesting that if you go back to 5 years old, your dad again, right? Your dad again, even at 5,
Yes.
influencing. But how funny that you had no idea you were gonna be a lawyer. You had no idea you were gonna do what you're doing, but all of that synchronicity of skill set was all the way through you, and somehow you fell into this career where it was obviously vital. Do you so that so that's it's amazing how the universe, the world, whatever you want to call it, works sometimes, right?
Well, and it's interesting, Andy, that you say I had no idea I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew early on that law was something that I was very interested in exploring. It turns out that my mother's father was a lawyer and later a judge in Michigan, and so I saw firsthand what he did, and I liked it.
Hey.
And then my father, of course, who didn't have the money to go to school, said, "You're going to go to college and you're going to go to law school," and
Okay, 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 okay.
no
So
ifs,
it
ands, or buts about it. So I pursued that career and knew fairly early on that that's what I wanted to do.
how interesting. Do you feel that sometimes with this people struggle from your experience to actually find their purpose or the vocation, or did you think because obviously it wasn't for you, you were kind of led into all this and kind of like primed to get to the top in your career, but from just looking around in the world, maybe you don't know because maybe you've just been so focused and isolated inside of the law world, but when you speak to do you have, is it probably a good question, outside of law and lawyers, do you have other people you associate with, meaning that they look at you and are inspired because of what you do? Have you felt that influence over to other? Because
Mm.
that's really why I wanted you on the show as well, because I was inspired by you.
Well, you're very kind, Andy, and I certainly will not say that I inspired other people, but I think other people saw what I did, and I certainly
Right.
encourage the people around me, and still do, the young
Mm.
people, to think big,
Yes.
and uh, whatever you want to do, just shoot for the top. And
I love it. I love it. So how did you, because shooting for the top is absolutely, absolutely. But there's a roller coaster on the way, right? And something I picked up straight away, I was saying your calmness. But how did you handle the stress? Because there must have been very stressful moments in that career of growing and expanding and bringing on partners. And how did you handle this on a personal level?
well, one thing I started doing early on is running. I
Hey,
every day I would get up and I would run before I went to work. And
hey,
I'd like to tell you that I'm still doing that every day. I'm not, but I still enjoy walking and running a bit. But so that was a good stress reliever for me. I went on to
mm,
run the Marine Corps Marathon here in Washington, and that was sort of
wow.
the pinnacle of my running career. But I would say that that was the biggest stress reliever I had over the years.
So that's what you did. So you literally moved your body. So if you felt overwhelmed or stressed, you became like a meditation, really, right?
Oh,
Running.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's how you.
every day.
That's the discipline too. That's
And
the
I would,
discipline.
when I was at work, yeah, I would sometimes run at lunchtime. And so the people in my office would see me put my running shorts on and top and run out. And I think that's something they took note of too, and probably started
Sure.
doing themselves. So
That's great. That's great. So that's because it's always interesting how people handle these different things. So that's a great thing. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Jim, is in the world of high level business and the people that you were interacting with, and these such like I can't even imagine the type of people. But you must have come across a lot of people with a lot of big egos, right? A lot of big
well,
egos who will come in and try to maybe bully you or push the situation. How did you how did you deal with that? And how did you handle your own ego in that situation?
yes. Well, you're quite right. In the course of my practice, I was fortunate enough to represent some of the biggest companies in the world, both in the United States
Oh,
and abroad. Incidentally, about half our practice was representing U.S. companies that brought these cases at the ITC, and the other half were companies that were manufacturing abroad and exporting products to the United States.
gotcha.
And typically, in working with these companies, I worked with their general counsel, in many cases, the CEOs of these companies. And
Right.
again, these among the largest companies in the world, and I won't name names now, uh, but throughout the world. And as I said, much of it in Europe, a number of big companies. And then Japan was a big exporter of all kinds of products you can imagine to the
Right.
United States,
Right. Right.
China, Korea,
Sure.
South Vietnam, or not Vietnam, but Taiwan.
Okay. Okay.
So you're right. I was dealing at the very, very senior levels of these companies that were involved in these cases.
Hmm.
And I just, I tried to be myself.
Okay.
And
Okay.
these companies recognized the importance of the litigation that they were
Okay.
involved in, and were very supportive of me generally. And, Jim, what do you need? What can I do for you? Let's go
Interesting.
to dinner, that sort of thing. So I got to know these people, these very senior people, on a personal level,
Yeah.
and made many, many good friends who remained my friends after the cases were over.
So really what you're saying there, if I can distill it, you you come in as business people and your heads might have been kind of butting, but because they also knew the value of what you can do, and also you would just be yourself, which meant that you saw them as a human being. You
Yes.
saw them as a person, right? Not just an entity in a machine. So you built rapport on a deep level with them personally.
Oh, there's no question about that, Andy. And many of the companies were quite large, but there were
Yeah.
a number of smaller companies. And the case that I was dealing with meant that they were either going to have a future or have no future, to have to shut down
Interesting.
as an operation if they lost the case at the
Interesting.
ITC. So recognizing the importance of the case to them, and them, for whatever reason, recognizing that I was the key to them
Sure, sure.
getting out of this problem, I developed some very close friendships as a result, because
Mm.
so much was at stake for them, and they entrusted me with their future.
I love that. And that's the key word with all of this, I suppose, with all your relationships and the way you do business, that key word there, trust. Right?
Yes.
There's a lot of trust that goes in, and it's because they're dealing with like life or death with their business, really,
Oh, no
right?
question. And they,
Yeah.
they have to entrust with me all of their secrets, some good, some
Yeah.
bad, but so they always put it all out on the table for me to hear, and the
Wow.
good, the bad, the ugly, and
Sure.
and to do that, they needed to trust me, and I hope all cases they did.
And so it goes back to I love it again. So it goes back to that key thing. And it feels like this has been right throughout your whole career. You haven't tried to be anybody else. You haven't tried to, besides your dad, which was the motivator, but you haven't tried to like live to someone else's expectations. You've just literally just knew who you were and just lived and breathed that. That's kind of rare in this world, Jim. I don't know if you realize that.
Yes, well, I thank you for that, Andy. And yeah, I always felt comfortable in my own shoes.
Yeah.
And I really felt that there was no one so big or so important that I couldn't deal with them on a one-to-one basis. And um, and so, quickly established that relationship of trust.
Yes,
And I
yes,
was
yes.
always comfortable in that position.
A key thing, the relationship of trust. That's a beautiful term. And for some reason, I've said beautiful about 5 times today, Jim. I don't know why, but it seems to be the word that keeps coming up.
That's
So
because you're
that
a very kind man. Yeah.
maybe I'm just fascinated. And so one of the other things I wanted to ask you is because you glaze over it because you are very humble. But let's go back to some. If there's somebody right now and they were starting their own business in whatever it is, and they were starting to build teams,
I'm
and
sorry, to build what?
my accent, mate, my accent,
No, no.
teams, like teams of
Yes,
lawyers,
teams.
or
Yes.
teams, yeah. Um, how do you manage all of those egos? How do you know that someone's a right hire? How did you run these teams, Jim? We'll
Well,
still practice in business. We'll still be with still being a CEO.
yeah.
How?
It was very important that I, of course, had to understand their experience and what their legal experience was.
Okay.
Um, um, but I also made a point of getting to know them personally. At
Yeah.
my firm, those were the days when people still came to the office every day.
Sure, 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 sure. Sure.
We would have, for instance, every week, every Monday at 9 o'clock sharp,
Okay.
everybody, all the attorneys, the non-attorneys, the staff would meet in a large conference room, and we would talk about the week ahead. So everybody would tell their story, and from the top to
Oh,
the bottom, it was important, and they were listened to. We
oh,
also made it a point of socializing quite a bit. We were many, many, many. I usually went to lunch with some of my friends at the firm. We
gotcha.
did a lot of holiday parties. We did weekend outings. We would take the entire firm to some of the local resorts in the Washington area, and we would play golf and have meetings and talk about the firm and how we could make it better. And so,
Mm.
the social element was very important.
Yeah. Okay. 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 Now it adds another layer to your success because again, we go back to you just being you, relationships, friendships, making people feel needed and seen and heard. And that went right down to the lowest member in your company, right up to the highest member in your company.
Yes, and I made a point, and you say the lowest person, but I mean, maybe the lowest paid person, but
Wrong word, wrong
doing
word.
the day-to-day jobs, and I
Sure.
would call upon them and ask them to speak to the entire firm. Everybody was required to get up and tell their story and what was on their mind, and how we could make our firm better. And I did that on a continuous basis.
That's brilliant, because that's such a again, I don't think people have the time, and maybe that's the calmness that came through the organization with you, because it feels like you allowed everyone to have time to think, time to express. You allowed the clients to have time. You allowed your executive team to have time. And
Yes.
that's the environment you created, right?
Yes, time and time together, and time together both in a formal setting and in informal settings, and getting out and walking a golf course, and with your colleagues was a
Sure,
great fun, and
sure.
a great bonding experience. And so we did a lot of that.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. Couple more questions, Jim. Couple more questions, because
Okay.
I know you're a busy man. It's I think some entrepreneurs especially can get so obsessed with their vision, right? And we're shooting for the stars, we're going after it. We all it's absolutely the most important thing. But then they can miss out on the other things of life. And I met your wife for a start. She's amazing, and I'm going to use this terminology, right? It's my generation maybe, but she's a badass, right? She's a badass in her own right in every way. Do you feel that it's so important if you're to have that partner? Maybe it's not a marriage, but maybe it's the close family or close like relationships I'm going back to. But do you feel that having that wife or home life partner is massively beneficial, or can cause a distraction?
No, it was essential for me, and
Mm.
had three sons, and who sadly all live in different parts of the world,
Right, right,
but that was in very close contact with my children, and still am.
right.
My wife, now, who I've been married to uh, coming up on 10 years,
Wow.
is an interesting story. And part of my attraction to her was not only her beauty, but
Sure.
she had a story similar to my father. She was from Turkey, and she 20 years ago decided to come to the United States, brought her two young daughters, uh, worked her way up, eventually became the White House correspondent for Turkish national television and radio. And so she was
Amazing.
on TV every day in Turkey, and uh, her uh, youngest daughter went on to become a lawyer, and she remembered she had met me before, and she said, "Oh yes, that Jim Adduci, he's a lawyer. Let me talk to him." So I met with her daughter, and I ended up hiring her in my firm.
The daughter?
And
Ah.
Mel, my wife, said, "Well, I really appreciate it. Let me take you to coffee." So we went out and had coffee, and uh, I had been a bachelor for about 15 years at that point, and I thought, might be nice to have someone to come home to. And she was that
Right.
person, and we've had a very wonderful time since then. And
Yeah, she's
uh,
lots of fun. She's such a high energy, and she's
yes,
one of the things I spotted with her is that she's really clever. Like,
oh,
she's really switched on.
I tell this story, Andy. She's the only person I know that throughout her education got nothing but straight A's,
Mm.
never anything less.
Yeah,
And
I can imagine.
so she's much smarter than I am.
She's much more than most
As are
people.
many people, right?
Hey, yeah, yeah. And so let's wrap this up, Jim, because I've loved this, and I could keep delving into your brain. I think for a long time. I'd love to know a couple of things. If you could rewind the clock in your life and career 20 years, let's rewind it all the way back 20 years, maybe 30 years, right? Is there anything that you would do different? Is there anything that you'd change? Is there anything that the knowledge that you have now, talking to that version, is there anything that advice you would give them?
Well, uh, this is a bit material, but I'll give you some advice that my father gave me that I didn't follow always. And that is that if you own real estate, whether it's a home or property, if you don't have to sell it, don't. Well,
Right.
I
Okay.
did not follow that advice. I sold the homes that I lived in before I went to the next one. I sold some property that I had.
Cool.
Had I not done that and held on to those properties, I probably would have retired earlier, much earlier. But so that's one bit of advice: is if you own property, particularly real property, and you don't have to sell it, don't. Um, and I think, one of the tensions you have in being in private practice and in trying to build a business is it's so time demanding that
Yes.
you don't get to spend a lot of time, as much time as you should have with your children. And remember once I asked my children, I said, well, do you want to go to law school and become a lawyer? And they said, no, Dad, we want to be able to come home at night. So, but anyway, I still have a wonderful relationship with them. And
Cool.
but you
Cool.
always wonder, had you had more time,
Mhm.
would that have been better? But no real regrets looking back, Andy. I'm
Great.
pleased to say.
That's great. That's great. Is there any advice that you give to a lawyer? And this was a final question. Is there any advice to someone who's a budding lawyer, um, and or wants to start their own practice, or is in their first 12 months of growing any type of business? What advice would you give from looking back with all your wisdom?
I would say just do it. If you have any doubts, just do it. Do it, and even if you don't succeed, you won't look back and say, "What if?" You've got to try,
Okay.
and so just go for it. That's my advice.
Shoot for the stars. Your dad's wise words, right? Be number one and think big.
Well, thank you, Andy. Yes, he was my inspiration.
Yes, mine too. I'm looking forward to reading this book. Jim, it's been a pleasure. At least we get to hang out in virtual land, if not in the Cayman Islands for now. But thank you so much. Is there? I don't know, because you're a retired man living your life of leisure. But is there any? Can we direct people to the book? Can we direct people to where's it somewhere we can send people?
Well, they can certainly contact me, and I
Okay.
can converse with them.
Okay.
Uh, my email address is my last name at mylastnamellp.com,
Okay.
and feel free
I
to
will put
contact
links
me.
everywhere, Jim. I will put links everywhere for everybody. Absolutely, absolutely,
Yes, and well, Andy, I look forward to seeing you soon, and
absolutely.
I'll give you some reading material, and we'll have some fun.
As we will, Jim. Thank you so much for today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Andy. You take care.
That's all for this episode of the Neuroperformance Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to stay connected, rate, review, and visit andymurphy.online to take the next step towards unlocking your pure potential. See you next time.